So you've seen that Scrum uses an empirical process to deliver software products. So that means that there's a chunk of software products that will work very well with Scrum. And then there's a smaller chunk of software products we don't necessarily need Scrum. It's still certainly possible to deliver software without using an agile approach. Typically, around 80% now of software products have an agile mindset. But that means that there's about 20% of software products that don't. And so what you want to look for with software products that you don't want to have necessarily sort of use Scrum or use an empirical process are ones where you have a lot of certainty and agreement. So it's sort of like these simple software products where you have your customer who says, I know exactly what I want this product to do. There's no chance that I'm going to change, and I know exactly when I want it delivered. And everybody agrees on what this software product should do. So you can make very detailed requirements, and then everybody sort of gets going and they just deliver the product, almost like manufacturing, kind of like the way I was describing building a bridge. I know exactly where I want this bridge to start. I know exactly where I want this bridge to end. I know exactly how much money I have for it, and so let's just do it. But software products, there's a big chunk of software products where you don't have that luxury, where either the software product is too complicated, and so there's not as much agreement or certainty on what you're going to need to deliver the product. And as these products become more complex, then you're more likely to run into disagreement, or it's going to be much more difficult to create detailed requirements. And then there's some software products which are called chaotic, where you have absolutely no agreement on what it takes to deliver the product, and everybody's uncertain on even where to start. And so for these chaotic products, you can't really even use Scrum. You sort of just, there's not much you can do to deliver a product when no one has any idea how to deliver it, and it's incredibly complex. But there's sort of like a sweet spot in between where Scrum works very well. And that's where there's some disagreement and there's some complexity and is a little bit complicated, and you want to be able to sort of move and inspect and adapt. And it's not kind of quite in the chaotic space, and it's not quite in the simple space, but it's sort of like this sliver in between where you want to be able to have an empirical approach where you can learn from your mistakes and quickly pivot if you want to make changes without falling into chaos or without knowing everything that you need to know to deliver the software. And so, I mean, if you go by what practitioners are doing, that's about 80% of software products right now. It's this little sweet space where there's a lot of complexity, there's some disagreement, but you need a framework where everyone can kind of get together and discuss what it takes to deliver the product with an empirical approach. It's not chaos and it's not simplicity. And that's kind of the area where you see a lot of Scrum products, or a lot of Scrum teams do very well delivering products. So when you start out using Scrum, one of the first concepts that you'll run into is this idea of a time box. And this even sort of ties in to Agile. Remember the principles, you want to deliver sort of a predictable pace. That they said that it was even weeks or months. So here, an Agile time box is a sprint. So a time box has actually got a very good name. It's intuitively named. It's a box, it's literally a box of time where you can't expand it. And in Scrum, all the events and everything you do has a time box. Even the people have time boxes. The sprints have time boxes. And the reason for that is you want the team to deliver predictably. And if to get that predictability, you need to have a time box. So if you think back to when I was talking about the iron vase, where you have sort of the set number of people and you have the set number of time, and so you could come up with a budget and you could come up with a schedule, but then you fill up based on scope. And so that set people and time is the time box. And so you want to make sure that all of the events that you have in Scrum stick very closely to the time allotted, and you'll see recommendations, actually more than recommendations, you'll see requirements in the Scrum guide for how long you should run each one of these Scrum events. And it's very important to stick to this time box. When you do your daily Scrum, it should be 20 minutes. When you do your sprint planning, it should be based on the number of sprints. If you have a 2-week sprint, that's something like an hour and a half. And so you have to have the time set up and in a box, and so that you can't sort of break out of it. And if you're working on a traditional organization, you don't necessarily have these time boxes. A lot of times you'll have meetings and they'll be set for a certain time. And you'll have a meeting room or something like that where everybody sits, and then you have to get out when somebody else comes in. But that's not the same thing as a time box. A time box means that the time that you allotted for the event once it elapses, you can't reschedule. You just have to go with what you've decided. So if you're doing a sprint planning meeting, then that has a time box. And once that time box is up, you have to go with whatever plan you landed on. You can't just be like, okay, well, we'll do sprint planning again tomorrow. And the same for retrospectives. You can't just be like, okay, I guess we didn't decide anything, so we're going to do another retrospective tomorrow. Because in sprint, remember, you want that predictability. So if you add an extra hour to your sprint planning, or if you double the amount of time that you do for a daily scrum, then you're going to add unpredictability to your sprint. It's going to be difficult for you to sort of have a predictable pace if you're not sticking with these time boxes. If the meetings are lasting 2 hours, one sprint, and then 4 hours the next sprint, an hour and a half the next sprint. So you have to stick with these time boxes, and whatever your team decides at the end of that time box, then you have to sort of go with that. And you'll see this a lot with backlog refinement in sprint planning, or if you have a backlog refinement meeting, is that a lot of times when you start breaking down these user stories, it becomes much more complex, and people could discuss these things for hours, and the time just seems to sort of fly by or drag by if you're listening. And so you want to make sure that you have a set time box for people to have these discussions, because you want to make sure that people get back to work and they're not kind of have these flexible schedules, because you have to deliver in 2 weeks, and so you want to eliminate as much unpredictability as possible. So you have to stick with these time boxes, which is a key part of the Scrum framework. Now this is much different. Delivering sort of in these time boxes or in these sprints is much different from how organizations may have traditionally delivered products, sort of back before the Agile Manifesto.